Now, this is where redlining comes in, the phrase. They're defining areas where it is most risky to loan people money. Now, they're based on the leading real estate appraisal book of the time, which lays down as a principle, the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups tend to lower the levels of land value and to lessen the desirability of residential areas. So with this principle in mind, Polk mapped neighborhoods and cities across the country where various groups labeled inharmonious were gathered, whether, depending on the city, they were Asian, Jewish, Italian, Polish, Greek, Mexican, Russian, or most commonly African American. So you see the irony. In the name of increasing home ownership, the primary form of intergenerational wealth building was systematically denied to others in a collaboration between the government and private business. Every American city had its own patterns of inequality, bearing the marks of its history. And Richmond's were stark and built on the patterns we've seen in the preceding century. So as we'll see that the greenest area is Windsor Farms, really the first suburb. And you can see when you go there that you can see the original documents where they describe the characteristics of it, or the rolling land and so forth. But then you can also go to areas that are blue, that are areas that are still desirable. There, and if you close that window, there we go, you can see West Hampton, noting the westward trend of the city. So they can already see the westward trend of the city. The yellow area is the Fan. This may be surprising to people. We think of today the Fan and Monument Avenue as sort of the prosperous part of the city, but they are noting in these documents that this is already converting to rentals. And they talk about the fact that a lot of these houses are way too big, they're designed for multi-units, and as a result, what you're seeing is that the Fan is actually in decline in the 1930s and 40s. And then finally, the red areas, the areas that account for a large part of the city. And you'll see the area D1, that it's where Jackson Ward, but other areas that have grown up as African-American communities after the Civil War are now being listed as there's lots of demolition to save taxes. So you can see both change and continuities in this. In general, today we see the culmination of a sorting that was underway in the 1930s. Presidential lending that was building on itself. We'll explore those patterns in a moment. So between 1940 and today came another change that accelerated the city's separation. This is a project, as you can see, called Renewing Inequality. This is about so-called urban renewal, which many critics of urban renewal called Negro removal. That what it really was about is the systematic displacement of people to make ways often for, as we all know, I-95 and I-64 running through the city. And so the blue lines there, you can see Annie's following with the cursor. And you can see that it's not an accident that they go where they go through. Annie's clicked on there. This is highlighting the areas that were redlining. And you can see the very same patterns in the 1930s. She clicks on poverty and race now. What we'll see is that areas like the Carver neighborhood, you can see how that they are 99% people of color are being displaced. The 17th Street neighborhood shows similar patterns. So you can see that it's not an accident that the interstate highways go where they do. And when they do, what this means is that these highways were driven through the very middle of neighborhoods that Black people had been working for generations to rebuild after emancipation, separating themselves from their churches and business and family members. So there's the redlining patterns, and you saw the poverty and race before. So you can see how patterns that began well over 100 years before are then amplified by changes in the middle of the 20th century. And of course, the irony is that those same highways that are driven through the middle of those neighborhoods also carried white residents away into new suburbs spreading to the west and the south, hollowing out the city neighborhoods, separating people into ever finer gradations of class, ethnicity, and even politics, as we will see. So we still live with all these changes, and I just want to, you can see on this screen the degree of detail, and this is really for all the cities in the United States that had urban renewal, and many of which were quite small, I think was a surprising fact that I discovered in all of this. So that is, we all know the way this forever shaped Richmond's landscape, and we know now that when people begin to recover Shockoe Bottom, it will be done by areas that you can look down on from I-95. It gives Richmond a chance to actually show it coming to terms with its past, as Laura said at the beginning, giving a chance to face our history. Now, the Digital Scholarship Lab has recently debuted a new site that makes the connections we've been exploring even more explicit and intriguing. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of a shame that it's so beautiful because the story that it's telling is disheartening and powerful. I will pause here and just say that you should be thinking of questions that you might have and add them to the Q&A, and Don will be gathering them. I'm not done yet, but I will be done in time for us to have some questions and answers. I just wanted to let you know if questions come to mind. So what this does, on the left, you recognize already the map of redlining of Richmond in the 1930s. It connects this with a new measure, the Center for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index, the SVI, which scores for census tracts today. So this is explicitly showing how the 1930s connect with 2020s. So the SVI combines a number of these factors: social and economic, housing and transportation, minority status and language, household composition, disability, to provide a metric of comparison between the areas. Now, since their development in the 2000s, these indices of social vulnerability are an important tool for emergency planning and public health assessment. So Annie's moving around so you can see all the different capacities of this. So Annie, let's go back to that and then move down the line, and we can see how some of these patterns unfold. So what you see is that areas that were yellow, that were definitely declining, some of them have recovered. We will all recognize here the gentrification of the Fan and the Museum District, even as some parts of it are considered today to have low SVI indexes. If we go to areas that were considered, and there's a case, look at this, an area that was definitely declining, now is in steep decline, is in deeply distressed by different indices of the SVI. What happened to the neighborhoods that were doing well before, Annie? Let's go to the very top and see what's happening to areas that were already fortunate. So we see that the largest decline is areas on the north side of Broad Street. This is near Scott's Addition, which we all know ironically is booming today because of breweries and restaurants and so forth, and an industrial area. But various neighborhoods that were near it, if we scroll down a little bit, Annie, let's see what else happens. Other areas that were doing well are exactly still doing well. You can see that they tend to move ever more to the west and to cluster in a sort of a band. Now, one of the things that we start to see is that what Annie's demonstrating here is that there are some areas that are bifurcating, and actually quite a few areas that are bifurcating today. So if we look at what we think of as also on the north side, Annie, let's go down just a little bit more, scroll down, yes. So what you can see here is that some areas of the north side are in distress today. The SVIs are having a hard time. But other areas of what we would think of as that region, there's another place that's struggling. But let's look at other parts. You can go ahead and click on some of the areas that are green, Annie, on the north side, to see at the same time that there are places that we would recognize in today's market that are flourishing. So if we look at then the Fan, let's see what's happening in the Fan now. We saw in the 1930s that it was in distress. What's it doing now? And what we're seeing is that it is I like the map with the different, if you close that, Annie, and go back to the ones we can sort of send the tendrils out, I kind of like that. So go into the C areas, and we'll be able to see on the left what you can see that, and then let's go down, let's look at, keep scrolling down a little bit more. There's the differentiation I'm talking about. Well, we can also see that areas like Churchill have split into quite prosperous and relatively distressed areas. Look at that. You can see the way that the gradations of difference are even more finely grained than they were back in the 1930s. What we know is that there are pockets of gentrification in areas that are otherwise struggling. So these are challenges that I know that many of the organizations in the city are thinking about and working to make better. I'm fortunate to be part of the Robbins Foundation board and to see the wonderful work they do in Churchill has been very heartening, as well as the University of Richmond. But in general, areas that were poor in the 1930s are even poorer today. And areas that were favored in the 1930s remain favored today. We are, in fact, more geographically divided than we were 90 years ago. The city bifurcating into ever more prosperous areas and ever more desperate areas. And we know the homeless situation that HomeAgain works so hard is deeply manifests this. Now, if the maps extended into the counties, we could see poverty spreading in Chesterfield and Henrico. We could also see people of Latin American ancestry are experiencing the same deprivations of housing, services, and education that Black people have long endured. Now, recent maps in the New York Times build on the maps that Rob, Justin, and Nate built to show that climate change affects the Richmond neighborhoods redlined in the 1930s in debilitating ways. It's very heartening to see work done in our colleges and universities. This involves students from VCU and ODU, as well as UR, gathering this information, building explicit, you'll recognize these patterns. And in the same ways that ads for the areas stretching to the west talked about their planted trees, how leafy and green they were. You can see without trees the effects of climate change on the poorest areas. So it seems unfair that areas that surfaced before, suffer before from low elevation, where water is coming through, are now suffering from so much asphalt and lack of trees that the very same patterns imprinted on the landscape are invisible today. And I think that you know too that another national report building on their work shows that COVID is concentrated in those same neighborhoods. In fact, nationally, the imprint of slavery remains stark as the virus has followed the paths of forced and free Black migration. So the idea is that watching history unfold over 2 centuries, as we did today, can help us understand where we stand and where we need to go. What we see is it took many hands over many years to create the situations that we now confront. The good news is that we can benefit from all the sectors represented among you on the call today: governmental, financial, civic, philanthropic, realtors, educational institutions. And together, as we cast our minds back over the legacies of the 1820s and then the 1920s, we can determine that we will do better in the 2020s. So Don, that's my overview of sort of the geography of inequality in Richmond over the last 200 years. And I think everyone can see the enormous amount of information that is made visible and clear in a way by this work that we simply could not see otherwise. And I just want to thank my friends again for making it available. So I wonder if you might want to pass on some questions that I might be able to address.
Yes. Let me start with sort of a technical question. Trina has asked what computer programs are used by DSL to generate these maps.
Yeah, a lot of this is custom made. And so there's no, a lot of the information is manipulated through geographic information systems, GIS, that are widely available. So like the data for the SIV and the SVI and these other data like here are widely available, produced by the government, made to interact with the GIS system. So the people at the DSL use those, but then have created, Robin, Justin, and Nate code this so that we can show things that nobody's ever shown before, as well as gathering all this. So some ways we're using widely available software, other ways these gentlemen are inventing the ways to do this that nobody else has yet.
Now, I believe that every participant will receive an email that gives them a link to these presentation materials that you have used so that they can look at it themselves. And also, I believe they'll get a video of your comments and answers to questions.
That's right. All the projects will be available at dsl.richmond.edu, digitalscholarshiplab.richmond.edu. And one of the things I'm especially proud about, all this is made at UR and then shared free around the world. So the whole idea is that it's meant to be inspiration for other communities to be able to do the same kinds of exploration. So, and it's great too that we have undergraduates learning how to make these things as well and to gather the detail. So you saw the project on East End Cemetery. That's lots of people pulling things together and sharing it in a collaborative effort. So I think some of us may be weary of technology right now, but this reminds us of the kind of commonality that we can find through technology. So yes, that's a lot to that question.
Yeah, let me give you a question from Mary Beth, and she'd like to know, and by the way, we are going to continue until 12:30. We will stop at 12:30. So if you have a question, try to get it in. Mary Beth wants to know, are there some projects in Richmond now that are having a positive effect?
Yeah, I was afraid somebody would ask this. I mean, I know that there are. Again, I mentioned that I'm fortunate to be on the Robin Foundation board, and seeing the proposals that are coming forward from, what's striking to me watching all of this, I'd rather not start naming names because there's so many people working on so many fronts. I've been really struck by the way that faith communities are working in their neighborhoods. I've been really struck by the ways that, like HomeAgain, Home is working on these important issues of equity to make sure that people have access to all of these kinds of things. So I could go down a list of things that I know about. We focus in the Robbins Foundation so much on children and early childhood education and welfare that you can see how organizations like Child Savers have been doing good work for decades. So what's interesting is that like HomeAgain, she says, it's been around nearly 40 years now, constantly adapting to these new changes. So the answer is yes. I named some, but I'd rather not just having a list of all of them. But what's striking to me is the way that people are collaborating. You know, the COVID crisis, you know, taking the schools with leadership, are ways for people who are dealing with things like childhood trauma or housing crisis or food supply or health issues or homelessness are all coming together and focusing to make sure that the children who are missing the food they would otherwise be getting at school are being taken care of, the child care providers are being taken care of. So you can either look at that and say, my goodness, the crisis seems to touch every facet of life, or as I prefer, we can look at it and see how there are good people in Richmond working on every facet of life.
All right, here's a very interesting question to me. It seems like there's greater consciousness in the country about these issues today. Why do you think it took the population so long to realize the problems associated with redlining and the issues you've discussed?
Ironically, it's partly because of the consequences of redlining and segregation. We know in Richmond, if you so chose, you could live pretty much insulated from a large part of these problems. You could live and shop and send your children to schools that do not reveal the degree of homelessness or poverty or hunger. And so when the city was more compact, people would at least see other people in distress. They might not care about them as much, but we've bought ourselves the opportunity to separate ourselves, people who have money to do so. And so, and you know, you don't have to look very hard to see how our schools are organized to understand how that is. So that's one reason, is it's simply less evident to people unless you seek out these kinds of organizations that are doing this work and that can tell you from it. So it's not that we are better than we used to, people than we used to be, and it's not that we're worse than we used to be. You know, I sometimes, you know, somebody who thinks about slavery and war for a living, I sometimes say, yes, I'm morally superior to everybody who lived in the 19th century, because I'm not. You know, we find ourselves in different situations. So what's the situation? I think the Black Lives Matter protest, focusing on Monument Avenue, are precisely to make visible problems that people can ignore if they choose. So I think that's why we've not seen them as much before. The great sorting, as social scientists have called all of this, has made this possible. It's also one of the byproducts and also one of the causes of our political polarization, is that people see and talk with people who believe what they do. And so that you persuade yourself that everybody sees the world this way. And you're shocked when you find that people don't. So why are we seeing it now in ways we've not before? I think it's because we've had, you know, moral leaders who've called it to our attention. You know, the work that the DSL is doing is a part, you know, other people are writing about the injustices that are also hidden away in our criminal justice system or in our prisons. I think this is why scholarship and journalism are essential to call our attention to things that, because of the way we're separated out, and of course the COVID doesn't help, and also the fact that we're living in our phones so much, ironically isolates us from other people in real time, even as it alerts us to studies of the problems that we're living in. So every period in history offers us opportunities and challenges. The trick is to sort through them to figure out, what can we do now that we couldn't do before? What can we see now that we couldn't see before? You know, the maps that we showed of the population movement of people, those were impossible until the folks at the DSL invented ways to see that. So ironically, the farther we get from the past, it doesn't mean that we see it less clearly. In some ways, we can see it more clearly. So I think that these are the very long results of the Black freedom struggle are still playing out. And partly we're still learning more about the depth and multiplicity of the injustices in which we're surrounded. I'm sorry, I see the number of questions are mounting, so I will give shorter answers.
All right, let me make one comment. I think that smartphones may have contributed to some of our divisions, but I actually think that they have a lot to do with why our consciousness is more raised today than it has been in the past.
I'd like to.
Here's a question that's very interesting to me. John says that Richmond has one of the worst situations in the country for evictions of renters. And I'm wondering if you know, especially in poorer neighborhoods, I'm wondering if you know why Richmond is particularly bad in that regard. Again,
speaking as a lay person, if we're talking about the present, I'm a lay person. I can talk about dead people all you want to, but it's a structure of law, is my understanding. is that it's in fact true that we at one time were one of the top 1 or 2 in the United States in evictions, and I think that we are still continuing in that. I think there was an article in the Times-Dispatch yesterday about these issues. It is the way that the law is structured, is my understanding, that encourages and permits that kind of removal of people from their homes, which is good news in the sense it could be changed.
Right. Tiffany has a question that you may or may not want to answer.
Which already means I don't.
Yeah, what impact do you think the ballot provision on redistricting will have on these issues? Do you think it will be positive or negative on the progress toward remedying the disadvantages of these poorer neighborhoods?
Yeah, here's what I would say is we've seen all the way, as long as Black people have had the vote, there have been white people who have tried to control and divide it. As I said, that is actually where Jackson Ward came from. So it matters enormously where district lines are drawn. I know that there are partisan differences on this, and I don't want to get into that. Here's what I'm saying is that the same data acquisition and manipulation and visualization that we're using here allows us to do that with a clarity and transparency that we've never been able to do before. What I'd prefer is that the largest number of people be able to see the rationale and the data behind the redistricting. I think that's the sunshine of democracy is our best way to make sure that whatever lines are drawn foster democracy.
Okay. What is your view of the role that housing projects or housing support can play in improving these poorer neighborhoods?
Well, something I didn't talk about, but that is central to all of this. I think that people know that Richmond has some of the largest housing projects in the United States. And it was a part of the same process of urban renewal in the mid-20th century. And one thing that we see here is that sometimes it's hard to pull apart good intentions and bad, right? Is that people of goodwill would have said, well, some of these blighted neighborhoods that the interstate is going through, it would be better to provide standardized housing that where conditions can be monitored and improved. Well, that might have been true, but if you sustain it for generation after generation without actually sustaining the conditions or actually improving them, they actually became a self-reinforcing prophecy of concentrated poverty and all the challenges that come with concentrated poverty. So the city now is working to distribute that housing, and I think that that seems to make sense to me, that mixed income housing seems to be a way to overcome the congruence of racial and economic segregation that have gone hand in hand. So I think whatever we can do to sort of stir this so that there is a greater chance at equity in schooling and in healthy food and in access to public services and in transportation, in all those ways, I think that we're on the right track in dissolving some of this concentration that was created in the very processes that we showed today.
Let me just make a comment on this issue myself. I think what is often called affordable housing is something that is greatly needed in our urban settings, and projects which increase the amount of affordable housing throughout the city seem to me to be something that may be helpful.
It's essential, yes.
Here,
I would say, ironically, as we showed on this map, the way the differentiation within neighborhoods like Churchill or the Fan or some places on the north side, places go from being disadvantaged to being priced out very quickly. And so you can go from having been neglected to now not being able to afford to live in the neighborhood. So things that are positive in the recovery of neighborhoods with investment have consequences that people don't intend. People who seek to move some of these neighborhoods don't intend for it to bring hardship to other people, but it can.
All right, this next question has a loaded term in it, but I really like this question.
I should have gotten somebody else to ask me these questions, Don. You're enjoying.
This is from Catherine, and I suspect she's a very nice person.
Okay.
So the term affirmative action is often used to criticize programs to help minorities. Would you agree that redlining is a type of affirmative action for white people?
Well, yes, I'll just go ahead and answer it in the sense that it is a government-sponsored activity to mobilize private resources that systematically advantaged white people. So yes, and one reason I think that the Hulk maps are so striking to us is it's not disguised in the language that we use today, better schools or whatever, that, a code often for racial disparities. It just says Negroes. It just lays explicitly things out. And it's also striking how much it is explicit about a language of race, of class that we don't use. It just talks about the best people live in these neighborhoods, and it's like the arrangement of your skin color and your economic status and your education just makes you a better person. And so I think that's one thing that makes these useful to understand. You can see the unspoken things like affirmative action had different names, but were certainly in action in the 1930s. Thanks for that good question.
Here is a two-part question from Rick, which is really, I'm very interested in what you have to say here.
Okay.
Richmond became majority Black quite a few years ago, maybe 40 years ago. And it's had a majority on city council for that long. Why, even with majority control of the city government, has it been so difficult to do things like improve public education, provide for affordable housing, improve public safety?
These are all products of the same processes that we've talked about here. Why does it become majority Black? It's because white people leave and move to the suburbs and take with them the community wealth in terms of a tax base as they take away their private wealth with them. So Richmond, and as I think people know, Virginia is quite unusual in having this distinction between its cities and its counties. And so even as the counties all around Richmond benefit from all the benefits of the city does not benefit from the tax revenues that have been taken away. So I see it as people working with sharply diminished resources to try to address problems that they know exist. I've been struck, meeting people who work across city government, state government. People want to fix this, but why is it so hard? It is because if we had, say, followed the path of Charlotte, in which our schools and other wealth was shared with the metropolitan area, I think you'd see more progress inside the city. So it's mainly, in my belief, mainly because essentially deprivation of resources caused by this migration.
I'm going to add my own 2 cents on this.
Good.
I think there is an increase in awareness of possibilities in the Black community that's making a difference today. I think the fact that so many of the Confederate statutes are now gone, the statues are now gone, is not because there's new power among Black politicians, but there is an awareness that they can do it. And I actually, and also there seems to be an awareness among all people that there are tremendous benefits to living in the city. And that's bringing wealth and population back into the city.
That's true. And now the goal is to make sure that that people who come back into the city keep their children in schools through middle school and high school. So I think that taking advantage of changes that the market is bringing, recognizing that it brings disadvantages as well, is our next step. Don, I will just point out we have 3 minutes, so choose your
Right,
questions.
and I'm gonna give you now what may be the most important question of all of these questions, and it's from Colleen. Can you identify some things which each of us can do as individuals to help improve this situation?
No, but I can recommend things that you can do together to improve the situation. There are so many organizations of such goodwill that are struggling with such limited resources that what an individual can do is to think about what 2 or 3 of those organizations do I have something to contribute to. Maybe it's just money, maybe it's time, maybe it's labor, maybe it's helping introduce it to other people, maybe it is promoting it in my faith community, maybe it's a chance to talk with my neighbors about how we would all benefit from this. So I think maybe thinking as individuals, this can look overwhelming. To think about centuries of inequity can be immobilizing. But all of us do this work, in fact, to mobilize us, to realize that, well, things have changed in the past, they can change now. But chances are none of these things were created by individuals. They were all created by groups. What we need to do is find the group that we can do the most with to advance. So don't disagree with me on that, Don. That's my final answer. And I want to make sure that's right.
I am going to offer a slightly different, which is yes. And I am of the belief that everything starts at the kitchen table. So the conversations with your partner, your spouse, your children are what we can do first.
Right.
And then I think in our religious communities, the conversations we can have there in Bible study groups, in breakout sessions, if you have a chance to be a preacher to your congregation or the leader of a group of people studying something, I actually think that these individual actions are very important and helpful.
I'd agree. I would say mainly that what I've noticed is that there is so much goodwill in this city. There is so much determination to make things better. As despairing as it might be to think about these patterns, I think it's inspiring to think about the sort of inspiration you just gave us, Don. So let's go have conversations with the people that we know and love and see if we can't make Richmond.
All right, we've passed our cutoff point, and thank all of you for participating, and you'll get an email and links and so forth. And thank you very much, Ed and Annie. Fantastic job running those slides under his whip hand.
Thank you so much, Don. Thanks, everybody.